A factory supervisor concerned with his employees' productivity wants to decrease idle time by implementing a system where employees receive a 10-minute break every 2 hours, regardless of whether they are actively working or not. What type of schedule is the supervisor using? All right, so let's think about this. It's a pretty straightforward basic reinforcement schedule question, but with a little twist. So, what do we know so far? We know the supervisor wants to increase productivity and decrease idle time. So, his system or his schedule says employees will get a 10-minute break every 2 hours. So, let's start there. What type of schedule are these employees on? Well, first, the schedule is based on either time or responses. And in this case, it's based on time. Every 2 hours, the employees get a break. And so, is that an interval or a ratio schedule? Well, that's going to be an interval schedule. Now, the second question is that schedule fixed or is it changing? If it's fixed, then it's going to be a fixed interval schedule. If it changes or if it's based on an average, then it's going to be variable. Well, we can see it's every 2 hours. It's not changing, therefore it's fixed. So we know the first part, it's a fixed interval schedule. Now the second part is it contingent or non-contingent? Well, the question says they are getting this break whether they are actively working or not. So is there a real contingency in place? No. Every 2 hours, employees are going to get a 10-minute break if they're working or if they're not. There is no contingency for gaining that break other than waiting for 2 hours. So this is a fixed interval schedule without a contingency. So let's look at A. Is it a contingent fixed interval schedule? No, because there is no active contingency. What about B, a non-contingent fixed ratio schedule? Well, we know it's not a fixed ratio schedule because it's not based on responses. C, non-contingent fixed interval schedule. Yes, this is non-contingent. There is no behavior contingency in place. All the employees are going to do is wait every 2 hours and get a 10-minute break. So they're getting a break on a fixed interval schedule. And then D, contingent fixed ratio schedule. We know it's not contingent and we know it's not a fixed ratio. What type of schedule is the supervisor using? C, non-contingent fixed interval schedule. A researcher is teaching a mouse to respond to different stimuli in certain ways. The researcher teaches the mouse to respond to the sound of a gong by walking to a blue card. Now, when the blue card is shown to the mouse turns towards the gong. What does this resemble? So immediately, if you've been studying and if you're getting more fluent, you're going to identify this as some sort of stimulus equivalence question, right? So we're dealing with reflexivity, symmetry, transitivity. And how do we know that? Well, because we've got two stimuli here and we're looking at them being equivocal. So let's look at this mouse that is being taught by the researcher. The researcher shows or teaches the mouse to respond to the sound of a gong. So let's call that A. You've got A by walking to the blue card. And so when they hear A, they go to B. So A equals B. So already this looks like symmetry. Now, when the blue card is shown to the mouse, B, the mouse turns toward the gong, A. Simple as that. Don't overcomplicate these stimulus equivalence questions, reflexivity, symmetry, transitivity. You just have to label the stimuli that you're looking at and then match them up. Transitivity is going to be the most difficult, right? Because we have 3 stimuli. But reflexivity is simply A equals A. Very straightforward. Symmetry is just inversing your first equivalence, A equals B. In this case, sound of gong equals blue card, and then blue card equals gong, right? And then transitivity is going to be A equals B equals C, which doesn't apply here. And then if we look at A, stimulus generalization, we're dealing with the same stimuli, right? The gong, the blue card, and the gong. So we're not generalizing any sort of stimuli. We're not generalizing here. This is a controlled experiment where the researcher is demonstrating C, symmetry. A nutrition coach finds that clients tend to follow dietary recommendations more closely when they're feeling hungry right before a session. She adjusts the scheduling so clients come in just before lunch to increase adherence to meal plans. What concept or manipulation is the coach using? All right, pretty straightforward question, pretty obvious. Let's look at what we know so far. We know the coach wants to follow dietary recommendations more closely when they're feeling hungry. So immediately, you should be thinking, all right, this is some sort of motivating operation question, right? Because when we're dealing with situations where you have a coach in this case who is having clients come in before lunch because we know she wants them to feel hungry, well, what is she trying to do? She's trying to get them deprived of food, to enter them in a state of deprivation, and manipulate the motivating operations so that following her dietary recommendations go up in value. And that's the way to think about motivating operation questions. What am I depriving of, or what am I satiating a person on? What am I trying to increase or decrease the value of? And then how am I going about doing that? The coach wants to increase the value of following the dietary recommendations. She knows if the clients are hungry or deprived of food, they will. So she manipulates her time schedule to put her clients, hopefully, in a state of deprivation, thus for increasing the value of those dietary recommendations. Now, she's not manipulating any discriminative stimuli. He's not changing the stimuli that signals the availability of anything. They're going to come in and the recommendations are always going to be available. She's trying to make them more valuable. She's not implementing stimulus deltas, where she's implementing a stimulus that signals the unavailability of something. And it isn't differential reinforcement because she's not reinforcing and putting behavior on extinction. She's simply manipulating that state of deprivation to increase the value. Now, when I say this is a straightforward question, what I mean is if you've been preparing and studying, these are one of those questions that you're going to answer very quickly. If you just started studying, then of course it's not going to be as easy. I'm just trying to identify questions where once you get to a point where you're fluent and confident in your abilities, you're going to be able to answer very quickly. A shipping supervisor wants to increase the number of products shipped per hour by his employees. He sets a goal that employees must ship at least 15 products per hour to receive a bonus at the end of the week. If employees ship fewer than 15 products per hour, they do not earn the bonus. What type of differential reinforcement is being implemented? All right, so we have a differential reinforcement question. And we always want to ask ourselves with differential reinforcement, are we teaching a replacement behavior? If we are teaching a replacement, then we can easily eliminate several options. So let's answer that. Are we teaching a replacement? Well, he just wants to increase the number of products shipped. He was not teaching a new behavior. What is he trying to do? He's trying to increase a behavior that already exists. So since we aren't teaching a new behavior, we know it's not going to be an incompatible DR, and it's not going to be an alternative DR. And so this question becomes quite simple after that. Because what is the goal? Well, the goal is he wants to ship a certain amount of product, a set criterion of product. And so if we go above or equal that criterion, you get reinforced. If you're below, you don't. So what type of differential reinforcement is being implemented? A differential reinforcement of other behavior. With the DRO, we are reinforcing for a behavior not happening in the absence of a behavior. We need the behavior to happen. We need at least 15 products per hour to be shipped. We just want to increase how often the behavior is happening. So A is out. B, differential reinforcement of higher rates of behavior. Clearly, right? We are trying to increase the rate of behavior. We need to ship more products. We need to meet my criterion. Once the criterion is met, I can increase the criterion to get that behavior more and more and more and more. C, differential reinforcement of lower rates of behavior. Lower rates is actively working to reduce a behavior, which we're not trying to do. And then D, differential reinforcement of incompatible rates of behavior. Like we talked about earlier, incompatible and alternative means we're teaching a replacement, which we're not doing, therefore it can't be D. So the answer must be B, differential reinforcement of higher rates of behavior. An organization conducts a survey to understand employee satisfaction and identifies that a major concern is the lack of flexibility in work hours. Based on this data, the HR department decides to implement a flexible scheduling policy that allows employees to choose their start and end times as long as they work 7 hours straight. Which of the following choices is most like what the HR department used to make their decision? This is kind of a abstract question where you've got to think a little bit out of the box. And typically on our exam questions, we're going to be very technical, right? We want to use terminology. We want to go by the book. Here, you have to think a little more critically about what is happening. What do we know so far? We know the organization conducts this survey to understand employee satisfaction, and they identify the lack of flexibility in work hours. So what is this similar to? Well, this would be like if you ask your employees or your clients what they are concerned with or what they want. As a result, based on the data, HR decides to implement a policy allowing them to choose their work week. So which of the following choices is most like what the HR department did? What did they use to make their decision? A, cultural integration. Now, could flexibility be culturally specific? Possibly, yes, but there were no cultural specific questions asked here. The survey simply asked, what is your satisfaction level? We're not identifying specific cultural variables. This is much more similar to B, client-informed goals. This is an employee-informed goal, right? The employees expressed lack of flexibility. HR, in response, changed the policy. C, skills assessment. There was no skills assessment done. We weren't assessing skills. We were assessing satisfaction. And then D, functional analyses. A functional analysis, of course, works to identify functions of behavior, which HR was not doing. So the answer here is B, client-informed goals. And again, a little more abstract, a little more non-concrete than a lot of answers. But again, once we break it down, A and B are the clear choices, and we're not talking about culture here. So we're much more concerned with the client, or in this case, employee-informed goals. Thanks for watching. Check out behavioranalyststudy.com for all of our study materials. When you pass, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. As always, like, subscribe, share, work hard, study hard, and we'll see you soon.